In March of 2026, a single drought month became the third driest month ever recorded in the United States, and the only 2 months that beat it were July and August of 1934, the worst months of the Dust Bowl. That is the company this drought now keeps. But the Dust Bowl set its record at the peak of summer, at the climax of its worst year. This drought set its mark in early spring, before the heat that drives a drought to its worst has even arrived. Across the country, the snowpack stands at 23% of normal, the Colorado River's great reservoirs are sliding toward record lows, and the wheat crop is at its worst rating ever measured. And every bit of that damage was done before the dangerous season started. So the question this video has to answer is the one nobody wants to ask out loud. If this is the opening, what does the peak look like? Quick note before we dive in. If you enjoy what we do here at The Outer Layer, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our tomorrow's reads. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The record. No one was supposed to see. There is a number that, until this spring, almost no one outside of a few quiet federal offices ever needed to think about. It is the amount of rain and snow that falls across the lower 48 states between the first day of January and the last day of March. For most of American history, that number has been profoundly unremarkable. It rises a little in wet years, it falls a little in dry ones, and in almost every year, almost no one notices it at all. It is the kind of statistic that sits in a database, gets logged, gets archived, and is never spoken aloud. This year, that number did something it has not done in 131 years. It fell further than it has ever fallen since human beings first began writing it down. From January through March of 2026, the contiguous United States received less than 70% of its average precipitation. I want you to understand exactly what that sentence means, because it is easy to let a number like that slide past you. It does not mean the driest start to a year in a decade. It does not mean the driest in a generation. It means the driest January through March in the entire instrumental record of the United States, a record that begins in 1895. The previous worst, the mark that had stood untouched and unthreatened for more than a century, was set in 1910. 1910. Think about how long ago that is. The people who were alive to see that record set are all gone now. The record itself outlived them by 116 years. It survived 2 world wars. It survived the Dust Bowl. It survived every drought of the 20th century and the first quarter of the 21st. And then, this spring, quietly, without most of the country noticing, it fell. Think about what that actually requires. Think about the physical reality behind it. It means that across the thousands upon thousands of weather stations that blanket this country, from the deserts of Arizona to the pine forests of Georgia, from the wheat country of Kansas to the river valleys of Tennessee, from the high country of Colorado to the coastal plains of the Carolinas, the sky simply withheld water on a scale that has no precedent in any year your grandparents lived through, or their grandparents, or anyone's grandparents going back to the era of the horse and buggy. The United States did not have a dry winter. That phrase is far too small for what happened. The United States had the single driest winter ever measured, and here is the part of this story that should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up, the part that turns a dry statistic into something genuinely unsettling. It is not summer yet. That single fact is the spine of everything you're about to hear, so I need you to hold on to it. I need you to carry it through every part of this video like a stone in your pocket. In the normal rhythm of the American climate, drought does not peak in the spring. It builds through the spring slowly, and then the long heat of summer arrives and begins to bake the moisture out of the soil, and the drought tightens its grip through July and August, and only then, in the hottest and driest depths of the year, does it reach its worst. That is the pattern. That is what every climatologist in the country expects, every single year. Drought in the United States is a creature of summer. It is supposed to be at its most dangerous at the end of its run, not the beginning. But the drought of 2026 did not wait for summer. It did not follow the script. It broke a 131-year record in the spring. It set its mark before the season that is supposed to make it worse had even arrived on the calendar. And so the question that hangs over this entire video, the question I want you to keep asking yourself through every figure and every map and every reservoir I'm about to describe, is brutally, almost frighteningly simple. If the country has already broken a record that stood since before the First World War, and it broke that record before the dry season even began, then how much worse can this possibly get before the rains finally return? Let me give you the shape of what we are actually dealing with, because the scale of it is hard to hold in your mind until you see the numbers laid out. As of the most recent reading of the United States Drought Monitor, the official weekly map of dryness in this country, dated the 19th of May 2026, 62.5% of the lower 48 states are in drought. Count in Puerto Rico, and the figure for the whole country lands at just over 52%. Roughly 158 million people, close to half of every single person living in the United States, are right now, today, as you watch this, living inside a drought zone. And 46 of the 50 states are registering moderate drought or worse. Not a handful of states. Not one unlucky region. Not the usual suspects in the desert southwest. 46 of 50. The dryness is not a regional event. It is the texture of an entire nation. I want to make sure you understand how the Drought Monitor actually measures this, because the categories matter, and you're going to hear them throughout this video. The Drought Monitor describes dryness on a 5-step ladder, and each step is a different colour on the map. The bottom rung is D0, abnormally dry. That is the yellow on the map, a region that is parched, that's heading in a bad direction, but that is not yet officially in drought. Then the real drought categories begin. D1 is moderate drought, D2 is severe drought, D3 is extreme drought, and at the very top of the ladder, the deepest, darkest red on the map is D4, exceptional drought. D4 is the category reserved for the kind of dryness that empties reservoirs, that kills crops in the field, that cracks the bare ground open into a mosaic of dried mud. When I tell you that 46 states are at D1 or worse, I am telling you that the lowest rung of true drought is now the baseline condition for almost the entire country. And here is something the map tells you that a single snapshot cannot. The drought is not holding steady, it is not easing, it is not even pausing. In the single most recent week of data, the drought footprint expanded by another 1.5 percentage points. It is still growing, the map is still getting redder, week over week. Whatever you picture in your mind when you imagine a record-breaking drought, the reality this spring is that it has not finished spreading. It is still on the move. I want to be careful here, because the outer layer does not deal in manufactured panic. We do not inflate things. We do not reach for a frightening word when an accurate word will do. We deal in data, and we let the data do the talking. So let me be very precise about what makes this a genuine story, and not simply a bad season that the country will shrug off. It is not only the raw size of the drought, although the size is staggering. It is the combination of three things that almost never line up at the same time. It is the largest drought footprint the country has seen at this point in the calendar year since modern satellite and station monitoring began. It is a severity that, by one particular measure you're about to hear about, sits directly behind the worst months of the Dust Bowl itself. And it is the calendar. All of that, every bit of it, before summer. There is a metric that captures the severity of this even more sharply than the precipitation number does, and it carries a name you may have heard before without ever knowing what it actually meant. The Palmer Drought Severity Index. It was created back in the 1960s by a meteorologist named Wayne Palmer, and what it does is genuinely clever. It takes precipitation, and it takes temperature, and it takes soil moisture, and it folds all three of them together into a single number that describes not just how little rain fell, but how thirsty the land itself has actually become. That distinction matters. A place can get a little rain and still be in deep drought if the heat is pulling moisture out faster than the rain puts it back. The Palmer Index captures that. It is, in a real sense, the long memory of American drought. And like the precipitation record, it runs all the way back to 1895. In March of 2026, the National Palmer Index reached its most severe level for any March in that entire 131-year record, the most severe March ever recorded. But it gets worse than that, and this is the number I most want you to sit with, the number that should stay with you after this video ends. When you rank March 2026, not just against other Marches, but against every single month in the entire record, every January, every June, every October, every month of every year since 1895, it comes in as the third driest month ever recorded. Third, out of more than 1,500 months of American history. And the only 2 months in that entire record that beat it, the only 2 months in the measured history of this country that were drier than this past March, were July and August of 1934. The Dust Bowl. The worst environmental catastrophe in the history of American agriculture. The years when the topsoil of the Great Plains literally lifted itself into the sky and turned afternoon into a kind of rolling black night. When the dust drifted against farmhouses like snow, when families abandoned their land and loaded their lives onto trucks and drove west by the hundreds of thousands because the land they had bet everything on had simply blown away. That is the company this drought keeps. I want you to really absorb that. When you measure the dryness of March 2026 against the full 131-year sweep of the instrumental record, the only thing standing between it and the very top of the list, the only 2 data points more extreme, are the 2 worst months of the Dust Bowl. And here is the detail that makes even that comparison land harder. July and August of 1934 were summer months. They were the deep heat of the year. They were the Dust Bowl at its absolute peak, at the climax of its worst year, after the summer sun had been hammering the plains for months. March 2026 matched their league while standing in early spring. So let me be clear about what we are and are not saying, because the distinction is the whole point. We are not telling you that 2026 is worse than the Dust Bowl. It is not, at least not yet. The peak of 1934 was worse than where we stand today. What we are telling you is something stranger, and in its own quiet way, more unsettling than a simple superlative. We are telling you that this drought has already pulled up alongside the Dust Bowl's worst recorded months, while standing at a point on the calendar where it has every climatological reason to still get worse. The Dust Bowl set its terrible mark at the top of the mountain in the summer at the end of its hardest year. This drought set its mark at the trailhead, in the spring, at the beginning, and that is exactly why the forecasters are not breathing easy. That is why this is a story worth 2 hours of your attention. The numbers are not frightening because someone made them frightening. They are not frightening because of the words wrapped around them. They are frightening because of where they sit on the calendar. America has run out of water faster than anyone predicted, and the part that should keep you watching, the part that the data keeps whispering underneath every single figure, is that the dry season has not started yet. Everything you have heard so far is the opening, not the conclusion. So before we go any further, before we look at what this drought is doing and where it could go, we have to answer a more basic question. A drought this large does not simply appear. It has a cause. It has an origin. And the origin of the 2026 drought was not written in the dry fields of Arkansas or the empty reservoirs of the Southwest. It was written in an ocean, thousands of miles away, months before the first crop began to wither. To understand the record, you first have to understand where all the water actually went. Part 2. Where the water went. To understand why 2026 became a record, you have to abandon a simple but wrong idea. The wrong idea is that a drought is just rain that failed to fall. It is so much more than that. A drought is a story, with a beginning and a middle and a set of causes, and the beginning of this particular story was written far from any dry field in America. It was written in the tropical Pacific Ocean, in a body of water that controls the weather of this continent far more than most people will ever realize. The character that set this drought in motion has a name you have almost certainly heard, even if you have never quite known what it does: La Niña. Now, if you have watched this channel before, you know that we have spent real time inside the machinery of the Pacific, inside that great planetary seesaw of warm and cool ocean water that climate scientists call the El Niño Southern Oscillation. So I am not going to rebuild that entire engine from the bolts up here. That would be its own video, and in a sense it has been. I am going to tell you only the part that matters directly for the dryness on the ground right now, the part you need in order to understand the record. La Niña is the cool phase of that Pacific seesaw. When the surface waters of the tropical Pacific run cooler than their normal temperature, the entire atmosphere sitting above that ocean reorganizes itself in response. The Pacific is so vast, and the ocean and the air are so tightly coupled, that a shift of even a degree or two in that water reshapes weather patterns across the whole hemisphere, and one of the most reliable, most well-documented consequences of a La Niña reorganization is a shift in the path of the winter storm track across North America. Picture the storm track as a river. Not a river of water, but a river of weather, flowing through the sky. It is the highway that carries storms, and the rain and snow they hold, off the Pacific and across the continent. In an ordinary winter, that highway dips far enough south to deliver moisture to a wide band of the country, including the southern tier. But in a La Niña winter, that highway gets shoved northward. The storms do not stop coming. They still roll off the Pacific, but they ride across the northern edge of the country and up into Canada, and the southern half of the United States is left sitting underneath a dry, stable, stubborn ridge of high pressure, watching the rain travel past to the north like a train that will not stop at the station. A La Niña pattern settled firmly into place around August of 2025, and it held on month after month through the entire winter. And so, week after week, the storms that should have watered the south rode north instead. Arizona stayed dry, Texas stayed dry. The whole long arc of the southern United States, from the deserts of the southwest all the way across to the Florida Peninsula, sat underneath that ridge of high pressure and waited for rain that the Pacific had, in effect, already decided to deliver somewhere else. That is the proximate cause of this drought. That is the trigger. La Niña pulled the trigger on 2026. But here is where you have to think carefully, because this is the most important reasoning step in the entire video, and if you follow it, everything else clicks into place. A trigger is not the whole gun. La Niña, by itself, does not explain a 131-year record, and the reason it cannot is simple. La Niña happens all the time. It is one of the most common patterns in the entire climate system. There have been dozens upon dozens of La Niña winters since 1895, and the overwhelming majority of those La Niña winters did not produce the driest start to a year in the whole instrumental record. Most of them produced an ordinary dry year, the kind of year the country shrugs off. So if La Niña is so common, and most La Niñas are survivable, why did this one break a mark that had stood since 1910? The answer is that the trigger was pulled on a landscape that was already loaded. And this idea, this single idea, is the most important thing in this entire video, so I'm going to slow all the way down and build it for you carefully, with an image you can hold. Imagine two houses, and imagine a man walks up to each one and throws a single rock at a window. At the first house, the window is brand new. It is thick, it is freshly installed, it is sound all the way through. The rock hits it and bounces off. Maybe it leaves a small chip, nothing more. The window holds. At the second house, the window is already cracked. It is already spiderwebbed with old fractures, it is already barely holding itself together in the frame, it has been one hard day from failing for a long time. The same rock, thrown by the same man with the same force, hits that second window and the whole thing shatters. It collapses out of the frame in pieces. Now the rock did not do that. Not really. The rock was identical in both cases. It carried exactly the same energy. What made the difference, the entire difference between a chip and a catastrophe, was the state of the window before the rock ever arrived. La Niña was the rock. And the American landscape heading into the winter of 2025 was the second window. The cracked one. So what do I mean when I say the landscape was cracked? I mean something specific and physical. I mean that vast stretches of this country did not enter that La Niña winter with full water reserves. They entered it already running a deficit, already short. The West, in particular, has been living for more than 2 decades inside what the scientists who study the rings of ancient trees now describe as the driest multi-decade stretch in roughly 1,200 years. 12 centuries. A megadrought so long and so deep that the reservoirs and the soils and the underground aquifers of the West have been running at a deficit for the entire adult lives of almost everyone watching this video. The soil across enormous portions of the country went into the winter of 2025 already low on moisture. The mountain snowpack savings account was already thin from years of disappointing winters. There was no cushion anywhere. There was no slack left in the system. The window was already a web of cracks. So when La Niña shifted the storm track north and the winter rains failed, that failure did not land on a healthy country with deep reserves that could comfortably absorb a single bad winter. It landed on a country that had, in effect, already spent its savings. And a single bad winter falling on top of an already empty landscape does not produce an ordinary survivable drought. It produces a record. It shatters the window. There is one more piece to this, and it is quieter than the storm track and quieter than the depleted reserves. But it matters, and a complete picture has to include it. The atmosphere itself is warmer than it used to be. And a warmer atmosphere is, in a very direct physical sense, a thirstier atmosphere. Warmer air has a greater capacity to hold water vapour, and it pulls moisture out of soil and out of plants, and off the surfaces of lakes and reservoirs, faster and more aggressively than cooler air does. Scientists call this evaporative demand, and it is rising. So here is the consequence. The very same rainfall shortfall, the very same number of inches of rain and snow that failed to fall this winter, produces a deeper, harsher, more punishing drought today than that identical shortfall would have produced a century ago. Because while the sky is delivering less water, the warmer air is simultaneously pulling more water back out of the ground. The drought is not only about what failed to come down from above, it is also about what is being pulled back up from below. Put those three things together, and you have the complete anatomy of 2026. You have a common trigger, La Niña, the rock that gets thrown at the window every few years. You have a landscape with no reserves left, the mega-drought depleted west, the moisture-starved soil, the thin snowpack, the cracked and webbed window, and you have a thirstier atmosphere accelerating every bit of the loss. And here is the crucial point. None of those three things, on its own, would have produced a 131-year record. A La Niña on a healthy landscape is just a dry year. A depleted landscape in a normal winter limps along. But all three together, at the same time, in the same season, that is what shatters a record that stood for 116 years. And once a region gets dry enough, it begins to do something genuinely unsettling, something that should change how you think about a drought this far along. It begins to feed itself. Let me give you the mechanism, because it is real physics and it matters for everything that follows. When soil has moisture in it, the energy of the sun goes partly into evaporating that water. And evaporation does two helpful things. It cools the surface, and it humidifies the air just above the ground, and that humidity in the lower atmosphere is part of the raw material that allows the next round of clouds and the next round of rain to form. But when the soil is bone dry, there is no moisture there to evaporate, so all of the sun's energy goes straight into heating the ground and the air directly. The days run hotter, the air just above the surface stays dry, and hot, dry air actively suppresses the formation of the very clouds and rain that could break the drought. Do you see the trap closing? A drought, once it is deep enough, physically modifies the atmosphere above it in a way that makes the next rainfall less likely to happen. The dry ground manufactures more dry sky. The drought, in a real and measurable sense, begins to defend itself. It is a feedback loop, and it is a large part of why a spring this dry is so genuinely dangerous heading into a summer. The drought is not just sitting there, passive, waiting politely to be rescued by the next storm. To a meaningful degree, it is working to keep that storm from forming at all. So that is where the water went. It went north, carried on a La Niña storm track, away from a country that could not afford to lose a single inch of it. And now that the trigger has been pulled and the window is shattered, we have to go and look closely at exactly what is breaking. Because the rain that failed to fall did not simply dry out the topsoil and leave it at that. It reached down. It reached into the rivers and into the reservoirs and into the hidden water that nobody ever thinks about until the day it is gone. And the first place that the missing water shows up, the first place where the absence becomes a hard, physical, undeniable number, is in a mountain range that was supposed to be holding the entire West's water in trust. Except this year, those mountains are very nearly empty. Part 3. The season that hasn't started. I keep returning to the calendar, and I'm going to keep returning to it again and again through this entire video, because the calendar is the single thing that transforms this drought from a bad year that the country will eventually forget into a genuine, serious warning. So in this part, I want to do nothing else. I want to do nothing but stare directly at the timing of this event, because once you truly understand the timing, every other number in the rest of this video changes its colour. The reservoir levels read differently, the fire statistics read differently, the crop ratings read differently. The timing is the lens, and I want to hand you that lens now before we go any deeper. Here is the normal shape of an American drought year. Think of it, if it helps, as a slow-motion sentence with a structure. The dry conditions establish themselves over the winter and the early spring. The soil begins the year already a little behind. Then, as the calendar turns toward May and June and July, the sun climbs higher into the sky each day. The days stretch longer, and the heat begins to build and accumulate. And that heat does something very specific and very important to a drought. It accelerates it. Every single hot day pulls more moisture out of the soil, out of the plants, off the open water of the reservoirs. Evaporation rates climb through the summer. The moisture deficit deepens. And so, a typical American drought reaches its most severe and most dangerous point not in the spring, but in the late summer, in August, sometimes stretching into September, after months of accumulated heat have done their patient punishing work on the land. That is the climatological expectation. That is the rule. Drought peaks in summer. Walk into any National Weather Service forecast office in the country and ask, and you will hear the same answer. The worst of a drought is supposed to come at the end of its run, after the long summer has wrung the landscape dry. Now lay the 2026 drought directly against that expectation and watch what happens. This drought broke the precipitation record in the window, running from January through March. It drove the Palmer Drought Severity Index to its third worst monthly reading in the entire 131-year record in the month of March. March. That is not late summer. That is not even early summer. That is the front end of the year. That is the part of the calendar where, by every normal rule the American climate has ever followed, a drought should still be quietly building, still loading, still gathering itself, not peaking, not setting records. So think carefully about what that actually implies, because the implication is the whole engine of this video. If a drought has already reached a severity that ranks behind only the Dust Bowl, while it is still standing at the starting line of the dry season, then the entire engine that normally drives a drought toward its worst, the long accumulating summer heat, the climbing evaporation rates, the lengthening days, all of it, every part of that engine, is still ahead. Still in the future, still waiting, fully loaded to be applied to a country that has already broken a record. This is what meteorologists mean, precisely and literally, when they say that the timing of this event is the most concerning thing about it. It is not a figure of speech. It is not drama. It is a cold, structural observation about where this drought sits in the year. The 2026 drought has front-loaded itself. It has reached in the spring a level of severity that the climate system normally needs the entire length of a summer to produce. And nothing about that early arrival cancels the summer. Let me say that again, because it is the hinge of everything. Nothing about the drought peaking early cancels the summer. The summer is still coming. The heat is still coming. The climbing evaporation is still coming. They are all simply going to arrive on schedule, on top of a drought that has already shattered a 131-year record before they got here. Let me put this into human terms, because the abstraction can slide past you, and the human version cannot. Imagine a runner who has signed up to run a marathon, 26 miles, and in a marathon the exhaustion, the real depletion, the worst of the suffering that is supposed to come late. At mile 20, at mile 22, near the end, after the body has been grinding for hours, that is the expected shape of the suffering. Now imagine a different runner. This runner is already at mile 6 as depleted, as wrung out, as hollowed out, as a normal runner would be at mile 22. Already, at mile 6, that runner has not finished the race. That runner has barely started the race. There are 20 miles still in front of them, and every single one of those 20 miles is going to be run from a body that is already, right now, past the point where most runners break down completely. That is the United States in the spring of 2026. It is at mile 6 of the race, with a mile 22 body. The race is not over, not remotely. The hardest part of it, the part that breaks people, has not even begun. And the country has to run all of it from a starting condition of record-setting depletion. And this is exactly why a question that sounds, on its surface, almost too simple to be interesting, becomes the genuine heart of this entire story. How much worse can it get? Because here is the thing. Normally, when you look at a severe spring drought, you can at least comfort yourself with a certain kind of knowledge. You can tell yourself that the system has shown you most of its hand. You can roughly see the worst of it from where you stand. But a spring drought that has already gone this far, that has already broken a record this old, has not shown you its hand at all. It has shown you the opening, the first move. And the opening move already matches the Dust Bowl's worst summer months. So the honest answer to how much worse can it get is not a number. It is a far more uncomfortable answer. It is, we genuinely do not know, because we have never been here this early before, and the part of the year that does the damage has not started. Now, I want to flag something here, openly and honestly, because intellectual honesty is the entire reason this channel exists, and I'm not going to let a dramatic point run away from the truth. There is one thing, one single thing, that could change this trajectory. The Pacific is shifting. The La Niña that started all of this, that threw the rock at the window, is ending, and something else is forming in its place out in that ocean. Something that, in theory, could bring the rain back to the very regions that need it most. So this is not a sentence with no possibility of appeal. There is a potential rescue, and it is real, and it is forming right now. But I am going to plant a single seed about that rescue here, and then I am going to leave it buried until we have earned the right to dig it up properly, later in this video. The seed is this: the rescue, whatever it ultimately turns out to be, runs on its own clock. And the rescue's clock and the calendar of the American summer are not synchronized with each other. There is a gap between them. There is an interval of time that separates them, and that interval, that gap, is the summer of 2026. And that summer is going to be run, mile by mile, by a country that is already at mile 22 exhaustion, while standing at mile 6 of the race. Hold that seed. Do not lose it. We will come back and dig it up when the time is right. For now, I want you to understand the timing for exactly what it is, stripped of all comfort. The 2026 drought did not break a record at the end of its run, the way a drought is supposed to. It broke a record at the very beginning, and a record broken at the beginning is not a conclusion. It is not a peak. It is a threat. It is the climate system telling you, in the clearest and bluntest language it has available, that whatever you're looking at right now, however bad it already seems, is not the finished picture. It is the early sketch, the rough draft, the first chapter. So now we go and we look at what that early sketch, that first chapter, has already done to the deep bones of the country. Because a drought of this size does not stay politely up in the topsoil where you can see it. It reaches downward, into the rivers, into the reservoirs, into the hidden water systems that no one ever thinks about. And the first of those systems, the first place the missing water shows up most starkly, and most undeniably, is a place most people never picture as a reservoir at all. It is the snowpack on the mountains, and this year the mountains are nearly bare. Part 4. The Empty Bank in the Mountains. There is a reservoir in the American West that almost no one ever talks about, and the reason no one talks about it is that you cannot see it the way you see a lake. You cannot put a boat on it. There is no dam holding it back, no concrete wall, no visitor centre, and yet it is, without the slightest exaggeration, the single most important water storage system in the entire western United States. It is the snowpack. And to understand why the 2026 drought is a crisis, and not just a statistic, you have to understand what the snowpack is, how it is supposed to work, and what was in it this year. Here is how it is supposed to work, and I want you to appreciate it because it is a genuinely elegant piece of natural engineering, a system that the West's entire civilization has quietly been built on top of. Through the winter, storm after storm rolls in off the Pacific and drops snow onto the high mountains, the Rockies, the Sierra Nevada, the high ranges of Colorado and Wyoming and Utah, the ranges that feed the great western rivers, and that snow does not run off immediately. It does not melt and vanish. It stacks up. Storm after storm, it accumulates into a deep, dense, frozen layer that sits high on the peaks all winter long, hundreds of inches deep in a good year. It is, in the most literal sense, a savings account. The mountains spend the entire winter making deposits into that account, locking water away in frozen form, and then, as winter turns to spring and spring turns towards summer, and the air slowly warms, that snowpack begins to melt. Slowly, steadily. And the meltwater runs down off the peaks, into the high streams, into the rivers, and down into the reservoirs, arriving exactly when the lowlands need it most, through the dry, hot months of late spring and summer, when no rain is falling. Winter fills the account. Summer draws it down, on a schedule, in an orderly way. The entire water economy of the American West, the cities, the farms, the power plants, all of it, is built on a single foundational assumption. The assumption is that the mountains will faithfully hold the year's water in trust through the winter and then release it, on a predictable schedule through the summer. Now I am going to tell you what was actually in that account this year, As of the 4th of May 2026, the snowpack in the Colorado River Basin, the single watershed that supplies water to roughly 40 million Americans, stood at 2.5 inches of what hydrologists call snow water content. That is the measure of how much actual water is locked inside the snow. 2.5 inches. The 30-year median, the normal amount for that exact same date on the calendar, is 10.7 inches. So the basin was sitting at roughly 23% of normal. 23%. Just under a quarter of what those mountains are supposed to be holding in trust at that point in the year. I need you to sit with that number, because it is one of the most important figures in this entire story, and it is easy to hear 23% and let it slide by as just another percentage. So let me make it concrete. The savings account that the entire American West relies upon to carry it through the dry summer was this spring nearly empty. More than 3/4 of the water that is supposed to be stored up on those peaks, frozen, waiting, metered out for the hot months ahead, simply was not there. It never fell. The storms that should have built that snowpack, deposit after deposit through the winter, rode north instead, carried away on the La Niña storm track we talked about earlier. The mountains this winter made almost no deposits at all. The account was left nearly bare, and here is the cruelty hidden inside a low snowpack, a second blow that most people never think about. A low snowpack does not simply mean less water, it means less water delivered on a broken schedule. Snowpack is valuable not only for how much water it holds, but for when it releases that water. A healthy, deep snowpack melts slowly. It is thick enough to last, to meter its water out gradually across the late spring and into the summer, releasing it across the very months that need it. But a thin snowpack, and especially a thin snowpack sitting under a warm spring sky, behaves completely differently. It melts early and it melts fast. It runs off in one quick pulse, and then it is simply gone, often weeks before the hottest, driest, thirstiest part of the summer has even arrived. So a 23% snowpack is a double failure stacked into one. There is far less water in the account to begin with, and what little water there is gets withdrawn too early, drained off before the season that most desperately needs it. This is what hydrologists call the snowpack timing trap, and it is one of the quiet, under-discussed ways that a warming background atmosphere makes every single drought worse than it would otherwise be. The water shows up at the wrong time, in the wrong amount, in the wrong form, and the reservoirs that depend on that water are left waiting for a delivery that comes light, comes early, and then stops coming altogether. So what actually happens to the rivers and the reservoirs when the mountain bank is empty? To answer that, we have to go to the most famous, the most studied, and the most quietly alarming river system in the United States, the Colorado River. And we have to look at the two enormous reservoirs that hold its water in storage. Lake Powell, held back by Glen Canyon Dam, and Lake Mead, held back by Hoover Dam. These are not ordinary lakes. I want to be emphatic about that, because if you picture them as just two big scenic lakes in the desert, you will miss the entire weight of what I'm about to tell you. These two reservoirs are the beating heart of water and power for the entire American Southwest. They supply drinking water to major cities, to Las Vegas, to Phoenix, to portions of Los Angeles and San Diego. They irrigate an enormous share of the winter vegetables that the entire country eats in the cold months. And the dams that hold them back, Hoover and Glen Canyon, generate hydroelectric power for millions of homes. When you talk about the water security of the American Southwest, you are in very large part talking about a single physical quantity. You're talking about the elevation of the water surface inside Lake Powell and Lake Mead, how high the water stands against the canyon walls. That number is, in a real sense, the vital sign of the Southwest. So here is where those reservoirs actually stand right now. The Colorado River system as a whole, every reservoir in it added together, is sitting at roughly 36% of its total designed capacity. Just over a third full. Now break that down. Lake Powell, specifically, is at somewhere around 23 to 24% of its capacity. Its water surface sits near 3,526 feet of elevation, and that elevation is more than 170 feet below what is called full pool, the level the reservoir reaches when it is genuinely, completely full. I want you to actually picture that drop. 170 feet of vertical absence. That is a wall of missing water, taller than a 15-story building. If you stood at the current shoreline of Lake Powell and looked up at the old high water mark stained on the canyon rock, You would be looking up the height of a skyscraper at the lake that was designed, while standing beside the lake that actually exists. Lake Mead downstream is doing slightly better in percentage terms, sitting at roughly 32% of capacity, which is another way of saying it is roughly 2/3 empty, and the projections, the forecasts for where these reservoirs are heading, are worse than where they stand today. The United States Bureau of Reclamation, the federal agency that manages these reservoirs and this river, runs what it calls a 24-month study. It is a rolling, continuously updated projection of where the water levels are going to be over the next 2 years, and that study indicates that Lake Mead could fall, during 2026, to a record low elevation near 1,036 feet. A record low, the lowest the lake has been since it was first filled, back in the 1930s, after Hoover Dam was completed, and Lake Powell is projected to do the very same thing. To fall to a new record low, breaking its previous record, and here is the detail that should stop you. The previous record low for Lake Powell was not set decades ago. It was set in 2023, 3 years ago. The system is now setting record lows so frequently, so relentlessly, that the records barely have time to get cold before the next one is broken. There is one number from the Colorado system that I find more genuinely chilling than any other, and I have deliberately saved it for right here. The amount of water that is forecast to flow into Lake Powell during the critical window from April through July of this year, the spring melt window, the period when the melting snowpack is supposed to be filling the reservoir back up, is roughly 800,000 acre-feet. Now, 2 things about that number. First, it is the lowest April through July inflow ever recorded for Lake Powell. The lowest ever. Second, and this is the part that lands hardest, it is only about 13% of the average for that period. 13%. Let that sit. The reservoir is receiving, this spring, in the season it most depends on, roughly 1/8 of the water it normally takes in, and you already know exactly why. The mountain bank was empty, sitting at 23%. So the river that the bank was supposed to feed has very little water to carry, and the reservoir that the river was supposed to fill is getting 1/8 of a normal year's springtime deposit. Each empty link in the chain hands its emptiness to the next. The situation has become serious enough that federal officials have moved into what can only honestly be described as emergency management of the river. They have announced operational measures. They are reducing the volume of water released from Lake Powell downstream to Lake Mead, trying to hold Powell up, and they are ordering additional releases of water from reservoirs further upstream, from places like Flaming Gorge Reservoir, sending that water down to try to keep Lake Powell above the critical elevations it needs to maintain its operations. When the federal agency that runs the river starts moving water around the system like a field hospital triaging patients, robbing one ward to keep another alive, that tells you something important about the condition of the patient. I want to pause on what a reservoir at 1/3 of capacity actually represents, because the percentage can hide the human reality inside it. When Lake Mead and Lake Powell were designed and built, in the era of Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam, they were sized for a particular vision of the Colorado River. They were sized for a river that was, frankly, more generous than the river that actually exists. The agreements that divide the Colorado's water among 7 states and Mexico were negotiated decades ago on the basis of streamflow measurements taken during what we now understand was an unusually wet stretch of the early 20th century. In other words, the entire legal and physical architecture of the Southwest water supply was built around a river that turned out to be a more generous river than the long-term average. The reservoirs were the buffer, the savings, the cushion that was supposed to absorb the gap between the river the West was promised and the river the West actually got. And what a reservoir at 36% of capacity tells you is that the cushion is most of the way to gone. The buffer that was supposed to absorb a bad stretch has spent most of the 21st century being slowly drawn down, and now a record drought is landing on top of a buffer that was already 2/3 empty. The window, again, was already cracked. The reservoirs are one more pane of that same cracked glass, and there is a psychological dimension to the bathtub ring that I think is worth naming directly. That pale band of mineral stain on the canyon walls, the line that marks where the water used to reach, is in a sense the most honest piece of communication in this entire story. It is not a forecast. It is not a model. It is not a number that anyone could argue about. It is a physical mark left on solid rock by water that was there and is now gone. When you stand at the current shoreline and look up at that ring, you're looking at a measurement that the lake itself carved, and it says, In a language nobody can fake or spin, this is how far we have fallen. Every foot of pale rock between the waterline and the ring is a foot of water the West used to have and does not have now. So this is the first place the missing rain shows up in hard, physical, undeniable form. Not as an abstraction, not as a percentage on a drought map, as a number painted on a dam, and as a ring carved into stone. The snowpack was at 23%. The spring inflow is at 13%. The reservoirs are heading towards simultaneous record lows. The water that the entire American West runs its cities and its farms and its power grid on is, this year, very simply, very measurably, not there. And if the Colorado River system were the only hidden water system under this kind of strain, that would be bad enough to carry a video on its own. But the Colorado is, at least, the hidden water system that everyone can eventually see. You can fly over Lake Mead and photograph the white bathtub ring on the canyon walls. There is another water system under this country, vaster than the Colorado, more important to the food on your dinner table than most people will ever realize, and it is completely invisible because it lies entirely underground. And the drought of 2026 is reaching down into that one too. Part 5. The water you cannot see. Everything we have talked about so far is water you can see. The rain that failed to fall, the snowpack that never built up on the peaks, the reservoirs dropping foot by foot toward a record lows. All of it is surface water, water with an elevation you can measure and a shoreline you can stand on and photograph. But underneath the Great Plains of the United States lies a water system that no human eye can see, and in a drought year that hidden system becomes one of the most important and one of the most quietly endangered resources in the entire country. It is called the Ogallala Aquifer, and to understand why the 2026 drought is so dangerous, you have to understand what is happening to it down in the dark. Let me start with what an aquifer even is, because the word gets used a great deal and pictured clearly almost never. An aquifer is not an underground lake. There is no vast open cavern of water down there. An aquifer is a layer of underground rock and sand and gravel and sediment, whose pore spaces, the tiny gaps between the grains, are saturated with water. Picture an enormous sponge, hundreds of feet thick, buried beneath the soil, every pore of it holding water. That is an aquifer. And the Ogallala, also called the High Plains Aquifer, is one of the largest in the entire world. It underlies roughly 225,000 square miles. It stretches in the dark beneath 8 states, beneath Texas, beneath New Mexico, beneath Oklahoma, beneath Kansas, beneath Colorado, beneath Nebraska, and beyond. And it is not an exaggeration, not even slightly, to say that this hidden body of water is one of the literal foundations of American agriculture. The high plains that sit above the Ogallala produce a genuinely staggering share of the nation's wheat, its corn, its cattle feed, its beef. That production exists, in very large part, only because farmers can reach down into the Ogallala with wells and pumps and pull that ancient water up to the surface to irrigate fields that the sky alone, especially in a dry year, could never keep alive. The Ogallala is the reason a semi-arid grassland became one of the most productive agricultural regions on Earth. Now here is the problem, and it is a problem that exists even in a perfectly wet year, but a drought makes it dramatically, dangerously worse. The water held in the Ogallala is, for all practical purposes, ancient. Much of it accumulated over tens of thousands of years, slowly, drop by patient drop, as a small fraction of rainfall and snowmelt seeped down through the soil and the rock and collected in those pore spaces over geological time. The aquifer does recharge. It does receive some new water from the surface, but it recharges slowly, agonizingly, almost unimaginably slowly, and for decades now, across much of its vast extent, water has been pumped out of the Ogallala far, far faster than nature is putting it back in. The withdrawals have outpaced the deposits for a very long time. To give you a sense of the sheer scale of that withdrawal, the rate at which water is being drawn out of the Ogallala has been described as equivalent, in annual volume, to something like 18 Colorado rivers. Now, I want to be careful and honest with that figure because it is the kind of number that can be misused. It is an illustrative comparison. It is a way of communicating a scale that is otherwise hard to grasp. It is not a precise hydrological equation, and you should not treat it as one. But as a way of grasping the raw magnitude of what is happening, it does its job, and it does it well. The Ogallala is being drained at a pace that dwarfs the flow of the most fought over, most litigated, most carefully managed river in the entire American West. And it is being drained from a reserve that took geological time, deep time, to fill. The consequences of that are already visible, already measurable in the wells. In parts of the aquifer, the water level has dropped by more than 100 feet since just the year 2001. More than 100 feet in a single human generation. A farmer who drilled a well to a certain depth 25 years ago may now have to drill it, or deepen it, dramatically further just to reach water that used to be near the surface. And the most severely overstressed zone, the part of the Ogallala that is under the very greatest strain, runs the entire width of the Texas Panhandle and then stretches northward roughly 450 miles. It is a long corridor of depletion running from around Lubbock, Texas, all the way up toward the Kansas-Nebraska state line, a wound in the aquifer 450 miles long. Now bring the drought into this picture, and you will see immediately why a dry year accelerates an already bad situation into a genuinely dangerous one. In a normal year, when the rain falls and the rivers run and the snowpack feeds the reservoirs, farmers can lean on surface water for at least part of their needs. They can share the load between what falls from the sky, what runs in the rivers, and what they pump from below. But in a drought, the surface water fails, the rivers shrink, the reservoirs drop, the rain simply does not come, and so the farmer who still has a crop in the ground, and a family to feed, and a loan at the bank to service, does the only thing left to do. He reaches deeper into the aquifer, he pumps more groundwater, and he pumps it harder, because in a drought year the groundwater is the only water left to pump. So a drought does not simply dry out the topsoil and damage one season's crop. It drives the entire country to draw harder, more desperately, on its single most irreplaceable reserve, and it does so precisely on the reserve that recharges most slowly, precisely on the reserve that, once it is genuinely gone from a given area, does not come back on any timescale that means anything at all to a human being. When a stretch of the Ogallala is pumped dry, you do not wait for one good wet winter to refill it. You do not wait a decade. You wait, in effect, forever. The water that took 20,000 years to accumulate in those pore spaces is not replaced in a human lifetime, or in a century, or in 10 centuries. There is a phrase that hydrologists use for water, like the deep Ogallala, and the phrase tells you everything. They call it fossil water. Fossil water? The same word we use for the ancient remains of things that lived in a vanished world, for coal and oil laid down in forests that died before the dinosaurs. Water becomes fossil water when it entered the ground so long ago, and recharges so slowly that for any practical human purpose it is not a renewable resource at all. It is a deposit, a one-time inheritance. When a farmer in the Texas Panhandle pumps from the deep Ogallala, he is not drawing on this year's rain, or last year's, or even his grandfather's. He's drawing on water that fell from the sky during the last ice age. Water that has been sitting in the dark in those pore spaces for tens of thousands of years, waiting. And every gallon of it that comes up as a gallon that, on any timescale a human family or a human nation can plan around, is simply not coming back. That is the quiet, strange tragedy underneath the productive farmland of the High Plains. The region's agricultural abundance has been running in part on a savings account that took an ice age to fill and a single century to spend down toward empty. And here is where the drought turns a slow, decades-long problem into a sudden one. In a normal year, the depletion of the Ogallala is a slow bleed, slow enough that it is easy for almost everyone to ignore. The wells drop a foot or two. The problem is real, but it is gradual. It is a problem for some future decade. But a record drought removes the slowness. It removes the gradualness. A drought year is a year in which the slow bleed becomes a hard, fast draw, because every irrigator who can reach the aquifer is pumping at maximum rate at the same time. All of them, all summer, because the surface water has failed and there is no other option. The drought compresses years of normal depletion into a single brutal season. It takes a problem that the country had told itself was distant and future, and it pulls that problem forward into the present. This is what makes the hidden water so essential to the story of 2026, and I want to connect it directly and explicitly to the central thread of this entire video because it would be easy to let the Ogallala feel like a separate topic, a detour, and it is absolutely not a detour. It is the same story. Remember the cracked window from part 2. Remember that the reason a common ordinary La Niña was able to produce a 131-year record is that the trigger was pulled on a landscape that had no reserves left to absorb the shock. The Ogallala is part of that depleted landscape. The slow draining of the Ogallala is one of the cracks running through the window. A country sitting above a steadily emptying aquifer is a country with less margin, less slack, less buffer, less of a safety net beneath it. And so it is a country where a single hard drought year does more damage, and pushes the whole system closer to a line that you genuinely cannot uncross. So now we have seen both halves of the hidden water crisis. We have seen the snowpack and the reservoirs, the visible water running down toward record lows, and we have seen the Ogallala, the invisible water, being drawn down faster and harder precisely because the visible water has failed. The drought of 2026 has reached into both of them, and in both of them it has found a system that was already far, far thinner than almost anyone watching this video ever realized. The water security of the United States, it turns out, has been running on margins most of us never knew were that narrow. But a drought does not stay down in the water system. It cannot. The entire reason that water matters so much is that life runs on it. A nation's food runs on it. Its forests run on it. So now we have to follow the missing water out of the rivers and the aquifers and up into the things that water is supposed to keep alive. Into the fields, into the rangeland where the cattle graze, into the dry standing timber of the forests. Because the drought of 2026 is no longer just a number painted on a dam or a falling level in a hidden well. It is already in the wheat, it is already in the cattle herd, and it is already, in the most violent way a drought can express itself, in the forests. Part 6. What the drought is already doing. Up to this point in the video, we have talked about the drought almost entirely in the language of measurement. Percentages, elevations, indices, inches of snow water content, and that language is necessary because the measurements are the evidence. But a drought is not in the end an abstraction. It is not a number. It is an event that happens to real, physical, living things. It happens to crops standing in a field. It happens to animals on the open range. It happens to forests full of timber that has not felt rain in months. And the 2026 drought, even now, even at this early point, even before its true dry season has properly begun, is already doing visible, costly, and in some cases permanently irreversible damage. This is the part of the story where the missing water stops being a statistic and becomes a consequence you can stand in front of and see. Let me start with the thing that matters most directly to every single person watching this video, no matter where in the country or the world you happen to be sitting: food. The drought has settled itself directly on top of the country's most important cropland. This was not random. As the La Niña storm track dried out the south and the plains, the drought footprint spread across precisely the regions that grow America's staple crops. Let me give you the figures, because they are stark. Roughly 70% of all United States winter wheat production now lies inside drought areas. Around 29% of the nation's soybean crop. Around 26% of the corn. These are not marginal crops grown on marginal land at the edges of the country. This is the heart of the American food supply. This is the bread and the feed grain and the protein base of the national diet. And the majority of the wheat crop is now growing, or rather struggling to grow, or in places failing to grow at all, in soil that is officially classified as being in drought. There is a reason winter wheat specifically is such a sharp instrument for reading this drought, and it is worth understanding. Winter wheat is planted in the autumn. It sprouts, establishes a small root system, and then goes dormant through the cold months, surviving the winter as a low green carpet before surging into growth again in the spring. That means winter wheat has been sitting in the ground, exposed, through the entire life of this drought. It went into the soil in the autumn of 2025, it endured the driest winter in the instrumental record, and it is now trying to make its spring growth surge with very little moisture beneath it. The wheat crop is, in a real sense, a living chart recorder of the whole drought. It has been measuring the dryness with its own roots, month by month, since before the drought even had a name, and what it is recording, in its lowest ever good to excellent rating, is a winter that the crop could barely survive, and the wheat is the clearest, loudest warning of all of them. As of the most recent assessment from the United States Department of Agriculture, only 30% of the country's winter wheat crop was rated good to excellent. 30%. I want to explain why that number matters so much, because if you do not work in agriculture, a crop rating can sound like an abstraction. When agricultural analysts look at a crop in the field and assign it a rating, they are essentially producing a forecast of the harvest to come. They are reading the health of the plants and projecting forward to the yield. And a 30% good to excellent rating is a forecast of a harvest in serious, serious trouble. It means the large majority of the crop, 70% of it, is rated only fair, or poor, or very poor. And here is the figure that puts it in historical context. That 30% rating is the lowest good to excellent rating on record. The worst the wheat crop has ever looked by that measure at this point in the season. On top of that, the USDA has projected that wheat acreage for 2026, the total amount of land actually planted in wheat, will be the lowest since 1919. Think about the length of that span of time. The lowest amount of American land planted in wheat since the year after the First World War ended. More than a century. Now let us move from the crops to the animals, because the drought reaches the cattle herd through a chain of cause and effect that is genuinely worth understanding step by step. Cattle, especially in the great ranching country of the plains in the west, eat grass and forage that grows naturally on rangeland. When the rangeland is healthy and green, the cattle essentially eat for free off the land. That is the entire economic model of ranching. But when drought scorches that rangeland, when the grass simply does not grow, the rancher is left facing a brutal choice with no good option in it. He can buy feed, he can buy hay and supplemental feed to keep his animals alive, but the price of that feed climbs precisely, cruelly, because drought has made feed scarce everywhere at the same time, so every rancher is bidding for the same shrinking supply. Or he can reduce his herd. He can sell animals early, send cows to slaughter that he would much rather have kept for breeding, simply because he physically cannot feed them through the dry months ahead. And the numbers show exactly how fast that pressure is built. As of the 5th of May, 2026, 61% of the country's cattle production areas were inside drought conditions. A year earlier, that same figure had been just 31%. So the share of American cattle country sitting in drought has roughly doubled in the span of 12 months. And the available evidence strongly suggests that ranchers are not expanding their herds, are not in any rebuilding phase, because you do not build a herd when you cannot feed the animals you already own. And here is the part that reaches into the future. A cattle herd that shrinks in a drought year does not simply bounce back the following spring when the rain returns. It cannot. Cattle take years to raise. A breeding cow culled and sold in 2026 is years of future calves that will never be born. A herd thinned in this drought is a smaller national beef supply not just this year, but for years to come. And that, right there, is the thread that runs directly from the cracked dry soil of the plains all the way into your own kitchen. Reduced wheat yields, reduced cattle herds, more expensive animal feed, all of it pushes in one single direction, toward higher food prices. The USDA, in its price forecast issued back in March, projected that food prices would rise 3.6% across 2026, and that was an increase from the 3.1% it had projected just 1 month earlier, in February. The forecast was already climbing, but here is the part I most need you to hold on to. That 3.6% forecast was made before the worst of the spring drought damage had even been confirmed. It was an early number. If the crops move from merely underperforming to outright failing, the reduced yields drive feed costs higher, and higher feed costs drive meat and dairy costs higher, and those increases can persist for years after the rain has finally returned and the drought is officially over. A drought year is not a one-year price event that the country shakes off. It casts a price shadow that stretches forward in time, long after the maps have turned green again. Now we come to the most violent, most immediate, most visually terrifying consequence of all. Fire. A drought does something very specific to a landscape, and it is something that should give pause to anyone who has ever lived anywhere near wild country. A drought takes everything that grows on the land, the grass, the brush, the chaparral, the standing timber, and it dries all of it out, and in the process it converts living vegetation into fuel. This is the key idea. A green, moist meadow is not going to carry a fast-moving fire. The water in the living plants resists it. But a meadow of drought-cured, bone-dry grass is something else entirely. It is functionally fuel lying on the ground, an unbroken bed of it, waiting for a single spark. A drought does not start fires. but a drought builds the conditions in which a small spark becomes an unstoppable one. And the 2026 fire season is already showing the country, in real time, what that means. By the middle to late part of April, wildfires across the United States had already burned more than 1.7 million acres, and here is the comparison that matters. That total is nearly double the average acreage burned by that same date over the previous 10 years. So the fire season is not merely bad. It is running ahead of its own schedule, pulled weeks early out onto the calendar by a landscape that the drought had already turned into fuel before the calendar said fire season was supposed to begin. And one fire in particular stands as a marker, a kind of grim milestone of what this drought is capable of. In Nebraska, the Morill Fire became the largest wildfire in that state's entire recorded history. It spread across more than 640,000 acres after strong winds drove it through vegetation that the drought had desiccated into perfect ready fuel. 640,000 acres, the single largest wildfire in the entire history of the state of Nebraska, and it happened in March. There is something worth understanding about why a March fire in Nebraska is so much more alarming than the acreage figure alone suggests, and it goes back to fuel. Grass and the fine, light vegetation of the plains are what fire scientists call flash fuels. They dry out fast, and once dry, they ignite easily, and they carry fire at tremendous speed when the wind is behind it. A drought-cured grassland under a strong wind is one of the fastest-spreading fire environments that exist anywhere on Earth. The Morill Fire did not need a forest. It needed dry grass and wind, and the 2026 drought had spent the winter manufacturing the first ingredient across the entire region. So a 640,000-acre fire in March is not a freak event standing on its own. It is a direct readout of how completely the drought had already converted the Nebraska landscape into fuel months before anyone would normally think about fire danger at all. And consider what the drought does to the people whose job it is to fight these fires. Firefighting resources, the crews, the aircraft, the equipment, are a finite national pool. They are staffed and budgeted and positioned around the normal calendar, the calendar that says the West burns in late summer. When the fire season arrives weeks or months early, that finite pool gets called into action before it's fully staffed up for the year, and it gets worn down earlier. A fire season that starts in March and runs hard is a fire season that asks the country's firefighting capacity to work a longer shift than it was ever built to work. The early start does not just mean more acres, it means a national response system stretched across more months than it was designed for. I want you to connect that fact back one more time to the calendar, because this is the central thread of the whole video, and this is one of the places where it bites down hardest. A fire season running at double the normal pace, a single fire setting an all-time state record, a national firefighting capacity called up early and worn thin. All of that is happening now in the spring, and the traditional peak of the western fire season, the most dangerous stretch of the year for wildfire, is the late summer and the early fall, the hottest, driest, most combustible end of the year. So the alarming fire numbers we are looking at right now are not the fire season at its worst. They are the fire season at its very beginning, already running at double pace, with a genuinely dangerous month still entirely ahead. Everything in this part, the withered wheat at its lowest rating on record, the cattle herds thinning across a double drought footprint, the food prices already forecast upward before the worst damage was even counted, the wildfires already burning at double the normal pace, every bit of it is the drought's downstream damage. It is what the missing water does once it has finished emptying the reservoirs and started reaching into living things. And all of it, every consequence in this part, is being measured and counted before the drought has reached the season that is supposed to make it worst. So that forces a question to the surface, a question that has been quietly building underneath this entire video, and we can no longer put it off or set it aside. If this, everything in this part, is the damage before the peak, then what does the peak itself look like? What is the genuine worst case here? We're going to have to look directly at it, and then, only then, we're going to have to ask whether anything at all, anything in the entire system, is coming to stop it. Part 7. The worst case. I want to be extremely careful in this part of the video, because this is exactly the part where a channel can lose its discipline, and the outer layer does not lose its discipline. We are going to talk, directly and unflinchingly, about the worst case, but I need you to understand, before we take a single step into it, what a worst case actually is, because it is constantly misunderstood. A worst case is not a prediction. A worst case is not a forecast of what is going to happen. A worst case is a clear-eyed, disciplined look at what becomes possible if the unfavorable version of every single uncertainty in the system happens to come true at the same time. It is not where we are heading. It is the outer edge of where we could conceivably go. And the honest, legitimate reason to look at it all is this. You cannot truly understand what is at stake in this drought. You cannot weigh it properly unless you are willing to look squarely and steadily at the far end of it. So let me build the worst case the way the system itself would build it, not as a single dramatic statement, but piece by piece, thread by thread, starting from what we already know for certain, and following each individual thread out to its difficult conclusion. Begin with the reservoirs. We have already established, with hard numbers, that Lake Mead and Lake Powell are projected toward record lows in 2026. That is not the worst case. That is the baseline expectation. Now, layer the uncertainty on top of it. Imagine the summer runs hot. Hotter than normal, which, in a drought year, with all that dry soil unable to cool itself, is genuinely the likely case. And imagine that the relief we are going to discuss in the next part arrives late, or arrives weak, or both. Under those conditions, the reservoirs do not just hit a record low and stabilize, they keep falling. And the danger there is not simply a lower lake and uglier scenery. It is that these reservoirs have critical operational thresholds built into them. There is an elevation, a specific number, below which the dams can no longer generate hydroelectric power efficiently. The turbines need a certain head of water above them to spin, and there is a lower elevation still, below which moving water through the system at all, delivering it downstream to the cities and farms that depend on it, becomes a serious physical problem. So the true worst case for the Colorado system is not a low lake. It is a lake low enough to threaten the electrical power generation that millions of homes depend on, and low enough to force the kind of deep, mandatory, legally enforced water cutbacks across the entire Southwest that would genuinely change how cities are allowed to grow and how farms are allowed to operate. Not a water shortage as an inconvenience, a water shortage as a hard, binding limit on civilization in the desert. Now take the fire thread and follow it to its end. We already have, right now, in the spring, a fire season running at double the 10-year pace, and we already have a single fire that set an all-time state record. That is the starting condition. The worst case is that the true fire season, the late summer and early fall peak, the genuinely dangerous stretch, arrives on top of a landscape that is even drier than it is today, because the summer heat will have had months to work on it, to pull still more moisture out of the soil and the timber. And the result of that, in the worst case, is not merely a bad fire season. It is a catastrophic one. It is a season in which megafire conditions, the term fire scientists use for the largest and most uncontrollable class of wildfire, the fires that generate their own weather and cannot be stopped by any human effort until the wind or the fuel runs out, become not an occasional event but the working condition of the entire summer. And every acre that burns under those conditions is more vegetation gone, more watershed damaged, more smoke poured into the air over distant cities, more homes and more lives at risk. Take the crops and follow them to their end. Right now, today, the winter wheat is underperforming. 30% good to excellent, the lowest rating on record. But underperforming is not the same as failing. The worst case lives precisely in the gap between those two words. A crop that is merely struggling still produces something at harvest. A reduced yield, a disappointing yield, but a yield. A crop that genuinely fails produces a small fraction of that, or, in the hardest hit fields, close to nothing. If the summer heat lands hard and early on a winter wheat crop that is already this stressed, and on the corn and the soybean sitting in drought-stricken ground across the Midwest and the plains, then the worst case is widespread crop failure rather than crop weakness. And we have already followed exactly where that chain leads. Failed crops mean a far smaller harvest. A smaller harvest means costlier feed grain. Costlier feed means a cattle herd that contracts even further as ranchers cull animals they cannot afford to feed. And a smaller herd and smaller harvest together mean food prices that climb, and then, crucially, stay climbed. Because a cattle herd takes years to rebuild, and an unsettled commodity market takes years to find its footing again. And take the Ogallala, the hidden aquifer, and follow it to its end, because this is the most permanent thread of all of them, and the one that should weigh on you the longest. A long, Hot, severe summer is, by definition, a summer in which every single irrigator who can physically reach groundwater pumps it as hard as the well and the pump will allow, because the surface water has failed and the crop in the field is dying in real time, and there is simply no other choice available to a person with a livelihood on the line. So the worst case for the aquifer is a full season of accelerated, desperate, maximum rate withdrawal that pushes parts of the Ogallala further down into the zone of depletion from which, as we established in detail earlier, there is no meaningful recovery. The reservoirs, remember, can refill. A few wet years and a strong snowpack and Lake Mead and Lake Powell can rise again. They have risen before, but the aquifer, once a section of it is genuinely spent, effectively cannot. So the worst case here includes a specific and terrible feature. It includes a piece of damage that does not heal when the drought finally ends. It simply becomes the new, permanent, poorer baseline. The country would emerge from the drought with permanently less water beneath it than it had going in. There is one more dimension to the worst case that I have not named yet, and it is the one that ties all four threads into a single knot. It is the way these threads feed each other. The threads I have just walked you through are not four separate problems sitting in four separate boxes. In the worst case, they connect and they amplify one another, and that is what turns a bad situation into a genuinely dangerous one. Walk it through. A catastrophic fire season strips vegetation off the watersheds, and a watershed stripped of vegetation handles water badly. So the next rain that finally does fall runs off faster and dirtier, and does less good. Failed crops drive irrigators harder onto the Ogallala, accelerating the one piece of damage that does not heal. Reservoir falling toward critical thresholds force water cutbacks, and water cutbacks push agriculture even harder onto groundwater, again drawing down the aquifer. A drought economy under stress, with food prices climbing and rural livelihoods strained, has less capacity to absorb the next shock. Each thread, pulled hard enough, tugs on the others. That is what a compound event is. It is not the sum of its parts. It is the parts multiplying each other. And the worst case for 2026 is precisely the case where the long summer gives those threads enough time to find each other and start to compound. Now, here is the discipline. Here is the part I promised you at the start of this section, and I'm going to hold to it firmly. Not one of those threads I just described is a certainty. Not one. The reservoirs might stabilize if the relief arrives in reasonable time. The fire season might stay merely bad instead of turning genuinely catastrophic. The crops might hold on, might cross from weak back toward adequate if the heat is merciful. The aquifer drawdown might prove moderate rather than severe. The threads might not compound. A merciful summer keeps them apart. Every single one of those better outcomes is genuinely, physically possible, and a responsible look at this drought has to hold all of those good possibilities open, right alongside the bad ones, with equal honesty. The worst case is not the forecast. I will say it as plainly as I can. The worst case is the edge, not the destination. But here is why we look at the edge anyway. Here is why you should not let yourself look away from it. Every single one of those worst case threads, the reservoirs, the fire, the crops, the aquifer, runs through the same single variable. They all depend on the same one thing, the summer, the length of the summer of 2026 and the intensity of its heat, and above all whether relief arrives before that summer has done its damage or after. The reservoirs falling to critical thresholds, the fire season turning catastrophic, the crops crossing from weak to failed, the aquifer drawn down past the point of recovery. All four of those threads depend entirely on how much hot, dry, punishing time the drought is given to work before something finally arrives to break the pattern. Which means the worst case is not really, fundamentally, a story about how bad the drought is. We already know how bad the drought is. We have spent this whole video establishing it. It is a 131-year record. That part is settled. The worst case is instead a story about time. It is a story about the gap between a drought that is already, today, at record strength, and a rescue that has not yet arrived. The longer that gap stretches, the further down each of those four threads the country is forced to travel. So everything, every thread we have followed, every worst case we have built, now comes down to a single question. And it is the question we have been deliberately deferring since part 3, the seed I told you to hold and not lose. Is anything coming to close that gap? Is there, in fact, a rescue? Because if there is, then the entire worst case depends on its timing, on when it arrives relative to that dangerous summer. And there is, in fact, something forming out in the Pacific Ocean right now. The very same ocean that started this entire drought may be preparing to end it. The only question, and it is the question that quietly decides everything, is whether it arrives in time. Part 8. The Rescue and its Clock. So let us finally go and look directly at the rescue, because there is one, or to be precise, and precision is the whole job here. There is at least the genuine, well-founded possibility of one, and it is forming in exactly the place this entire drought began, the tropical Pacific Ocean. Remember the seesaw from Part 2? Remember La Niña, the cool phase of that great Pacific Oscillation, the phase that shoved the winter storm track north and starved the southern United States of its rain, and set this whole drought in motion? Here is the thing about a seesaw. A seesaw does not stay tipped down on one side forever. That is not what a seesaw does, and the La Niña that drove the 2026 drought is ending. It is, as I speak these words to you, already on its way out the door, and we can actually watch it end, in the data, in real time. NOAA tracks the temperature state of the tropical Pacific using an index called the Oceanic Niño Index, and that index tells the story with real clarity. In the late part of 2025, the index was sitting down around minus 0.55. That is solidly, unambiguously, in cool La Niña territory. The negative sign means cool water. But then, watch what happens. By the February through April season of 2026, that index had climbed all the way up to plus 0.11. It crossed the line. It crossed from negative to positive, from the cool side to the warm side. The Pacific moved out of the cool phase entirely and into the warm side of neutral, and it is, as of now, still warming. The seesaw is tipping back the other way, and it is not tipping back slowly, or tentatively, or uncertainly. There is a powerful pulse of warm water moving across the Pacific right now, a phenomenon oceanographers call a Kelvin wave, and it has been intensifying, loading the tropical Pacific with warmth from below. On the strength of that warm pulse, and the broader state of the ocean, NOAA and the international forecasting agencies have put the probability of El Niño, the warm phase, the direct opposite of the pattern that caused this drought, developing by the May through July window of 2026 at somewhere between 82 and 98%, depending on which agency and which specific forecast product you look at. And they put the probability of that El Niño persisting onward into the winter of 2026 and 2027 at around 96%. So this is not a maybe. This is, by the standards of seasonal climate forecasting, close to a sure thing. The warm phase is coming. Now, why does that matter for a drought? Here is the part of the story that finally introduces a genuine thread of hope, and I want to give it to you fully, because this video is not a story of pure descent. El Niño, the warm phase, tends to do roughly the opposite of what La Niña did. Where La Niña shoved the storm track north and dried out the southern United States, El Niño tends to pull that storm track south, steering the rain and the storms back over the very regions, the south and the southwest, that have been baking and cracking under this drought all year. El Niño usually, and I'm going to lean hard on that word usually in just a moment, brings cooler and wetter conditions to the southern tier of the United States. So for a drought-stricken south and a drought-stricken southwest, the developing El Niño is the single most plausible mechanism for genuine relief anywhere on the horizon. The same ocean that opened this drought may be preparing right now to close it. So why then is this not simply a happy ending? If the rescue is real, and the odds of it are above 90%, why have I spent this entire video building tension and dread, only to tell you in part 8 that help is on the way? Because of the clock. Because the rescue and the disaster are running on two completely different clocks, and those two clocks are not synchronized with one another. And that single fact is the most important thing in this entire part of this video. Here is the timing problem, laid out plainly. El Niño's wetter influence on the southern United States does not switch on the instant the ocean crosses from negative to positive on the index. It does not work like a light switch. El Niño's effect on American rainfall expresses itself most strongly, most reliably, most measurably in the late autumn and the winter. That is when the warm phase pattern most dependably delivers rain to the American South. Late autumn, winter, the end of the year and into the year beyond it. Now lay that timing directly against the calendar of the drought, the calendar we have been tracking since part 3. The drought is at a record right now in the spring. The season that normally, climatologically, drives a drought to its absolute worst is the summer, the months immediately, directly ahead of us. And the rescue, the El Niño rain, does not reliably arrive until late autumn and winter, which is months after that dangerous summer is over and done. Do you see the gap now? Do you see the actual shape of it? There is an interval of time between the drought as it stands today and the relief that El Niño can credibly bring. And that interval, that gap, is precisely, exactly, almost perfectly, the summer of 2026. The single most dangerous season for a drought, the season of maximum heat and maximum evaporation and maximum fire risk. The season that drives every one of the worst-case threads we built in Part 7 sits squarely, entirely, inside the gap between the record we already have in hand and the rescue that is still months and months away. This is the seed I planted back in Part 3 and asked you to hold and not lose, and now we have earned the right to dig it all the way up and look at it in full daylight. The rescue is real. I am not taking that back. But the rescue is late. It runs on the Pacific's clock, and the Pacific's clock says late autumn, and the drought runs on the summer's clock, and the summer's clock says now, says the next several months. The country has to cross the entire summer before the rescue can plausibly arrive, and it has to cross that summer carrying a 131-year record on its back the entire way. And there is one more piece of honesty that I owe you here, because it makes the gap even less comfortable than it already is, and leaving it out would be a kind of lie by omission. The strength of this El Niño is not yet certain. There is a well-known, well-documented obstacle in the science of seasonal forecasting, and it has a name. Scientists call it the spring predictability barrier. It is a stretch of the calendar centered on the spring, during which the tropical Pacific is especially stubbornly difficult to forecast, during which the eventual strength of a developing El Niño or La Niña is genuinely mathematically hard to pin down in advance, and we are, right now, forecasting this particular El Niño through that barrier. So here is the honest situation. The odds that an El Niño develops at all are very high, above 90%. That much is solid. But exactly how strong it ultimately becomes, and therefore exactly how much drought-breaking rain it ultimately delivers to the parched south, that carries real and unavoidable uncertainty. The rescue is very probably coming. Its size, its strength, the amount of relief it actually carries in its hands is still genuinely unknown. So let us put all of it together, the hope and the hard limits both, because the honest picture contains both. The rescue is real, and that is genuine, and it is the entire reason this video is not a story of pure, unbroken descent into catastrophe. There is a turn coming in the Pacific, the seesaw is tipping, and that turn favours the south, favours exactly the regions that need it most. But the rescue is late. It is structurally, fundamentally late. Late by the basic physics of how and when El Niño expresses its influence on American weather. And that lateness leaves the entire summer of 2026 exposed, uncovered, unprotected. And on top of that, the rescue's ultimate strength is still uncertain, because we are forced to look at it through the fog of the spring predictability barrier. The honest framing, and it is the only honest framing available, is this. Relief is probable, but relief is not imminent. And the interval before it arrives, that exposed and dangerous summer, is the most dangerous single stretch of the entire event. The drought has set its record. The rescue has set out across the ocean toward us, and the summer is the long, hot, dangerous distance that still lies between them. Before we close this video, though, there is one more thing we have to deal with directly, and it is a thing this channel never skips. Because a drought this large, this visible, this genuinely frightening never travels alone. It always arrives accompanied by a second set of explanations. The explanations that say the data is fake, or that the drought was made on purpose by someone for some reason. Those explanations are out there right now, and millions of people are encountering them, and they deserve a clear, direct, and honest answer. So let us give them exactly that. Part 9. The stories people tell, and the one the data tells. Whenever the natural world does something on this scale, something this frightening and this national and this impossible to ignore, a second drought always forms right alongside the real one. a drought of explanations, and some of those explanations hold that what you're seeing is not really natural at all, that there is a hand behind it. The outer layer does not mock those ideas, and we do not pretend they do not exist, and we do not wave them away because millions of people genuinely encounter them, turn them over, and quietly wonder if they might be true. So we are going to do here exactly what this channel always does. We are going to take the 3 most common alternative explanations for this drought. We are going to state each one as fairly and as sympathetically as we honestly can, and then we are going to hold each one up against the actual evidence and see what survives the encounter. The first claim is the biggest of the 3, and the one with the most emotional force behind it. It says the drought is engineered, that somewhere, some government program or some private effort, is deliberately steering the storms away from the United States, that the rain is being held back on purpose, through weather modification or geoengineering. Here is the fair version of that concern, stated as strongly as I can state it. Weather modification is not science fiction. It is not a fantasy. It exists. Cloud seeding is a real, operational technology used in real places by real governments and water agencies right now. So if human beings can touch the weather at all, even a little, then the reasoning runs, perhaps they can touch it on a scale large enough to cause something like this. That is not a stupid thought. It starts from a true premise. But here is what the evidence actually shows when you follow that true premise to its real conclusion. Cloud seeding, which is the only operational weather modification technology that exists at any meaningful scale, can do exactly one thing. It can slightly improve the efficiency with which a cloud that already exists converts its existing moisture into precipitation. That is the whole of it. The effect is modest, a local enhancement on the order of single-digit to low double-digit percentages, and crucially it requires a cloud already there to work with in the first place. It cannot create a storm out of clear sky. It cannot erase a storm that exists, and it absolutely cannot pick up the continental scale river of weather that is the storm track itself and physically relocate it hundreds of miles to the north. The amount of energy required to hold a planetary scale wave pattern in place across an entire continent for an entire season is so enormous, so vast, that it dwarfs anything human technology can inject into the atmosphere, and it does not dwarf it by a little. It dwarfs it by many orders of magnitude. It is the difference between a single person blowing on a sailboat and a single person trying to blow a hurricane off its course with their breath. The scales are not in the same universe. And there is one more piece of evidence that quietly, completely dismantles the engineering claim. This drought was forecast in advance. The La Niña signal was clearly visible in the data months ahead of time, and the dryness that followed was anticipated in public from that signal. A secret, deliberate, covert program is, by its very definition, secret. But a drought that scientists openly saw coming, and openly explained ahead of time from a well-understood and entirely natural pattern, is the precise opposite of a covert act. It is a predicted, published consequence of a known and natural cause. The second claim is quieter than the first, but it runs deep, and it has been growing. It says the data itself is being manipulated, that this is not really a record at all, that the numbers are being exaggerated or inflated or simply invented for some purpose. The fair version of this concern is, in a sense, a healthy instinct. People should ask where numbers come from. Skepticism about official figures is not in itself a flaw. So let us answer the question directly and completely. The figures in this video do not come from a single source that could be quietly adjusted by a single hand. The United States Drought Monitor is a joint product. It draws on multiple federal agencies and multiple academic institutions working together, and its maps are published every single week, publicly, for anyone on Earth to download and examine. The precipitation record comes from NOAA, and it is built from thousands of physical weather stations spread across the country. The Palmer Index is computed from that same public physical record. The reservoir elevations at Lake Mead and Lake Powell are not opinions, and they are not estimates. They are direct physical measurements of where the surface of a very large lake actually physically sits against canyon walls that anyone can drive to and look at. They are reported continuously, and they are verifiable by any person who stands on the shoreline and looks at the bathtub ring on the rock. The snowpack numbers come from an automated network of telemetry sensors sitting in the mountains, measuring the snow directly. So for the record to be fake, for the manipulation claimed to be true, you would need a single coordinated fabrication spanning many independent instruments, many separate agencies, many universities with their own reputations and their own scientists, and an unbroken historical archive of data stretching back to 1895. That is not how the data is produced, and it is not how those institutions actually work. The record is real. The simplest explanation, and in this case also the correct one, is that the numbers are extreme because the drought is extreme. The third claim is less a theory than it is a feeling, and because it is a feeling, it deserves to be treated gently rather than argued with harshly. It says that a drought this severe must be a sign of something, that it must be proof of some long-predicted collapse, evidence that the planet or the country is being deliberately pushed toward catastrophe by someone for some end. And here, the honest answer is, in a strange way, the most sobering of all three, because the honest answer does not require any hidden hand at all. This drought is severe, it is historic, it is a 131-year record, and I have not softened that fact for a single second of this video, and I'm not going to start now. But it is not unprecedented in the deeper story of this continent. The Dust Bowl at its 1934 peak was worse than where we stand today. The long megadrought that has gripped the American West for more than 2 decades is, by the evidence locked in the rings of ancient trees, the driest such stretch in roughly 1,200 years. Severe continental-scale drought is a recurring feature of the North American climate. It has happened before this. It will happen again after this. The honest reading of 2026 does not need a villain standing behind it, and inventing one actually makes the truth smaller and more manageable than it really is. Because the real truth is this: a common natural climate pattern landed on a landscape that had been stripped of its reserves, under a warmer and thirstier sky, and the result was a record. That is not a conspiracy. That is something far more demanding to sit with. It is a real physical system showing you, in plain numbers, exactly how little margin it has left. In every one of these 3 cases, the position of this channel is the same, and it does not change. The alternative stories are worth understanding, genuinely worth it, because understanding what people believe, and understanding why they believe it, is part of taking those people seriously as people. But the data does not support the alternative stories, and the real explanation, the one assembled entirely from public, verifiable, physically measurable scientific record, is dramatic enough and serious enough on its own. It does not need to be embellished with a hidden hand. It needs to be faced. So let us face it. And let us close this video where we began it. The United States has recorded its driest start to a year in 131 years. It has driven a drought index to a level that, across more than 1,500 months of measured history, ranks behind only the 2 worst months of the Dust Bowl. It has done this with 62% of the lower 48 states sitting in drought, with 158 million people living inside the dry zone, with the Colorado River's great reservoirs falling towards simultaneous record lows, with the mountain snowpack that the whole West depends on standing at 23% of normal, with the hidden Ogallala Aquifer being drawn down faster and harder toward a line that has no return on the other side of it, with the nation's winter wheat at its worst rating on record and a wildfire season already burning at double its normal pace. And it has done every bit of that in the spring, before the dry season, before the heat, before the part of the year that, by every single rule the American climate has ever followed, is supposed to be the part that makes a drought worse. There is a rescue. It is forming out in the Pacific, and it is real, and it favours the very regions that need it most desperately. But it runs on its own clock, and that clock says late autumn, and between now and then lies the summer, the longest, the hottest, the most dangerous stretch of the entire event, and the country has to cross all of it, mile by mile, carrying a record on its back. So the question we started this video with is the same question we end it with. But now, after everything, you can feel the full weight of it. If America has already broken a 131-year record before the dry season has even begun, then how much worse can this possibly get before the rains finally return? And will the rescue that is forming out in the ocean arrive in time to matter, arrive in time to spare the country the worst of it, or will it arrive too late, after the hardest summer the American landscape has faced in living memory has already done its work? The water is not coming back on our schedule, it is coming back on the planet's schedule, And the gap between those two schedules, that exposed and dangerous stretch of months, is where the next chapter of this country is going to be written. There is something almost humbling in that, if you let yourself feel it. A nation that is used to setting its own clocks, used to deciding its own timelines, is, on this one question, simply waiting. Waiting on an ocean. Waiting on a seesaw of warm and cool water thousands of miles away to finish tipping. The most powerful country on earth cannot hurry the rain. It can only prepare and endure and watch. Keep watching the map. It is still getting redder, week over week. And whatever else you take from this, take this. It is not done yet.